"You're not worth the invitation, Rachel. You never were." My father said it into a live microphone, in front of 300 people, at the exact moment the MC handed it to me to give the sibling toast. For a second, I genuinely thought I had misheard him. Then I saw the smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth, and I understood he meant every single word. It had been 11 years since Gerald Bennett had lived in the same house as me. 11 years since he packed 2 suitcases into the trunk of a car that wasn't my mother's and drove away without looking back. And now here he was, holding a microphone that should have been mine, telling an entire ballroom of strangers exactly how little he thought of me. I felt the blood drain out of my face and pool somewhere cold in my chest. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My brother Ethan, standing at the head table in his tuxedo, looked like someone had knocked the wind clean out of him. And 2 tables over, a silver-haired man in an impeccable navy suit slowly set down his champagne glass and turned his head toward us with an expression I would spend the rest of that night trying to decode. If you're interested in this story, please support this channel by subscribing and leaving a like. Your warm support gives me a lot of strength. My father had been drinking since the cocktail hour. I knew at the moment I saw him laughing too loudly near the open bar, his tie already loosened, his eyes glassy in a way I recognized from childhood. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I was 32 years old, financially independent, respected in my industry, and that nothing this man said could reach the parts of me that actually mattered anymore. I was wrong. In that exact instant, our entire family's carefully maintained peace suddenly came to a screeching halt, and the man sitting 2 tables over, the father of the woman my brother had just married, was about to hear a version of my family that none of us had ever intended for outsiders to see. My name is Rachel Bennett. I work as the founder and CEO of a boutique data analytics consulting firm based in Charlotte, North Carolina, one that quietly serves several of the largest hospitality and real estate groups on the East Coast. I live alone in a converted loft near Uptown, the kind of apartment I bought with cash after 6 years of building something from absolutely nothing. I have never once thrown my success in anyone's face. I never needed anyone's approval to know I had built something real. I simply believed that even if my own father couldn't see my worth, that didn't mean I didn't have any. However, I never imagined that the deepest wound in my life wouldn't come from a stranger, a business rival, or even a broken heart. It would come from the one man who was supposed to love me unconditionally, using the happiest day of my brother's life as the stage for his cruelty. Gerald Bennett is my biological father. He left our family when I was 10 years old, and Ethan was barely 2. He didn't leave quietly. He left loudly, dramatically, blaming my mother, blaming the marriage, blaming everyone except himself, and then he vanished into a new relationship with a woman he'd been seeing for the better part of a year without either of us knowing. For a while, there were birthday cards. Then there were missed birthdays. Then there was nothing at all except the occasional phone call that always, somehow, ended with him needing money. My mother, Diane, was left to raise 2 children on a substitute teacher's salary, clipping coupons, working weekends, quietly falling apart in a bathroom with the door locked so we wouldn't hear her cry. I remember watching her hands shake while she balanced the checkbook at the kitchen table, and I remember making a private vow to myself that I would never, ever be a woman who depended on someone else to survive. 3 years after Gerald left, my mother met Robert Hale. Robert wasn't flashy or loud. He was quiet, steady, the kind of man who showed up early and stayed late. He owned a small chain of boutique hotels back then, nothing like the hospitality empire he'd eventually build, but even in those early days, he had a way of making our cramped apartment feel like it had enough room to breathe again. He married my mother when I was 14. He never once tried to replace Gerald in my life. He simply showed up, again and again, at every parent-teacher conference, every soccer game, every terrible middle school band concert, until one day I realized I trusted him more than I had ever trusted my own father. 2 years after the wedding, my mother gave birth to Ethan's little sister, and then for years after that, to Ethan himself. Robert Hale is Ethan's biological father. He is also, in every way that has ever mattered to me, mine. Growing up, Gerald would resurface every so often, usually when he needed something. A loan to cover a car repair. money for rent after a business venture collapsed, a place to stay for a few weeks that always stretched into a few months. Each time, I gave him what I could, first out of guilt, later out of a strange, stubborn need to prove to him that I had turned out fine without him, that I had grown into someone capable and generous despite his absence. Over the years, those loans added up to nearly $40,000, none of it ever repaid, all of it documented in my bank statements because some quiet, cautious part of me always suspected I might need proof one day. I never told my mother the full extent of it. I didn't want her carrying my father's failures on top of her own memories of him. I still remember the first time I gave him money as an adult. I was 23, fresh out of business school, working my first real job, so proud of the modest apartment I'd just signed a lease on that I'd taken a photo of the empty living room and sent it to everyone I knew. Gerald called 2 days later, his voice warm in a way it rarely was anymore, asking about the apartment, asking about my job, asking all the right questions in the right order until he finally arrived at the reason for the call. He was 3 months behind on his truck payment, he explained, and the repo company was threatening to take it, and without a truck he couldn't work, and without work he couldn't dig himself out of the hole he'd fallen into. I remember the specific, embarrassing rush of pride I felt at being needed by him, at being the one with enough to spare, at finally being useful to a man who had spent most of my childhood making me feel like I wasn't enough of anything. I wired him $1,100 that afternoon. He thanked me for exactly 4 sentences before pivoting to a story about his new girlfriend's daughter's soccer tournament, a child I had never met, in a family I had no part of, and I hung up the phone feeling, for reasons I couldn't fully articulate at the time, strangely hollow instead of proud. That pattern repeated itself, almost identically, 7 or 8 more times over the following decade. A dental emergency. A security deposit for an apartment he lost within 4 months. A down payment on a used car after the truck was eventually repossessed anyway, despite my $1,100. Each time, the call would open warm and end transactional, and each time, some small, hopeful part of me would let itself believe that this particular loan would finally be the one that changed something between us. It never was. Meanwhile, my mother rebuilt an entire life from nothing, working double shifts some semesters just to keep the lights on, and never once, not a single time in 11 years, did Gerald offer to help cover a single bill for the children he'd actually raised for a decade before he left. The math of it never stopped bothering me, even after I'd made peace, or thought I had, with everything else. What Gerald never understood, what he refused to understand, was that his absence hadn't broken me. It had built me. I threw myself into my studies, earned a full scholarship to business school, and by 26, I had left my corporate analytics job to start my own firm with nothing but a laptop, 3 months of savings, and a stubborn refusal to fail publicly the way my father had. I built quietly, deliberately, taking on small hospitality clients first, then mid-sized regional chains, then, eventually, companies whose names people actually recognized. I never advertised my success to my family. Gerald had spent so many years calling me cold, calculating, and unmarriageable that I'd simply stopped bringing my achievements home. Somewhere along the way, silence had become easier than explanation. When Ethan called to tell me he was engaged to Olivia Whitman, I cried real, happy tears. Ethan is 8 years younger than me, and I practically helped raise him during the years Robert and my mother were building their business from the ground up. He is soft-spoken, loyal, and endlessly kind, everything Gerald never bothered to be. Olivia, it turned out, was the daughter of Thomas Whitman, a hospitality magnate whose hotel group operated luxury properties across 4 states. I had actually heard the Whitman name before in industry circles, though I'd never made the connection until Ethan mentioned it. Small world, I remember thinking. I had no idea just how small it was about to become. The wedding planning consumed the family for nearly a year. Robert and my mother insisted on paying for the majority of it, a gesture of pure joy rather than obligation, since Robert genuinely adored Olivia and wanted nothing more than to give his son a beautiful beginning. Gerald, predictably, resurfaced around the 6-month mark, calling me first instead of Ethan, which should have told me everything I needed to know about his intentions. "Rachel," he said, his voice already carrying that familiar wheedling edge, This Whitman family has real money. I can't show up to that wedding looking like I don't have 2 nickels to rub together. I need something decent to wear, a nice watch, maybe help covering a wedding gift that doesn't embarrass me. You understand, don't you? You've always understood these things better than your brother. I remember standing in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, feeling something inside me that had been slowly hardening for 11 years finally reach its limit.
No, I said.
I'm not doing that this time. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that told me he genuinely hadn't expected resistance. Excuse me, he said. I said no, Dad. I have given you money for over a decade. I have never once seen $1 of it come back to me, and I have never once heard you say thank you in a way that didn't come with another request attached. If you want to look presentable at your son's wedding, that's between you and your own bank account. His voice dropped, turning cold in the way it always did when he didn't get what he wanted. You've gotten awfully high and mighty since you started playing businesswoman, he said. Must be nice, forgetting where you came from. I didn't forget where I came from, I told him, my voice steadier than I felt. I remember exactly where I came from. That's precisely why I'm saying no. You've always been like this, he continued, before I could respond, his tone shifting into the wounded, self-righteous register he reserved for moments when he sensed he was losing control of a conversation. Cold. Calculating. Ever since you were a little girl, you always had to make everything about fairness, about who owed, who what. Your brother would never talk to me like this. I laughed, a short, humorless sound that surprised even me. Ethan hasn't talked to you like this because Ethan hasn't had 11 years of practice cleaning up your messes, I said. Give him time. He might learn. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I genuinely wondered if he'd hung up already. Then his voice came back, quieter, colder. Fine, he said. Don't come crying to me when you need something someday. I bit back the urge to point out that I hadn't asked him for anything in over a decade, that the traffic on this particular road had only ever flowed in one direction. He hung up on me. I stood in my kitchen for a long time afterward, staring at the phone, waiting for the familiar wave of guilt to hit me the way it always had before. It never came. For the first time in my adult life, refusing my father hadn't felt like betrayal. It had felt like breathing. I should have known, looking back, that a man like Gerald doesn't simply accept a boundary and move on quietly. Men like Gerald don't absorb rejection. They store it, let it curdle into something sharper, and wait for the moment it can do the most damage. I didn't know it yet, but my father had already decided that if he couldn't extract money from me before the wedding, he would extract something else entirely on the day itself, in front of every important person he could possibly humiliate me before. What I didn't find out until much later was that Gerald hadn't stopped at me. 2 days after I refused him, he called Ethan directly, laying on a version of events where I had callously abandoned my own father right before the biggest week of Ethan's life, apparently hoping to guilt my brother into pressuring me on his behalf. Ethan, to his enormous credit, saw through it immediately. He's called me 3 times today, Ethan told me over the phone, sounding exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with wedding planning. He wants me to talk you into giving him money for a suit. I told him if he needed a suit, he could ask me directly instead of trying to guilt trip you into it through me. Rachel, I don't want him anywhere near the head table if he's going to keep doing this. I remember feeling a strange mixture of relief and guilt at hearing that. Relief that my brother saw our father clearly, guilt that Ethan was already being forced to manage Gerald's behavior before his own wedding had even started. I called Ethan back that night to check in, worried the pressure from Gerald might have put a strain on him right before his own wedding. He sounded tired but resolute. Honestly, he said, part of me is almost glad this is happening now instead of after the wedding. I don't want him thinking he gets a permanent seat at every future family event just because we let him show up for one more milestone. I told him I appreciated him standing firm, and he laughed quietly. You've been doing this alone for a lot longer than I have, Rachel, he said. It's about time somebody else in this family learned how. A week later, Gerald tried my mother, a tactic I found almost unforgivably calculated given everything she had already survived because of him. He called the house phone Robert, and my mother still kept for emergencies, and according to Robert, who answered it, Gerald spent nearly 20 minutes trying to convince Diane that Rachel had grown cold and cruel, that success had changed me, that someone needed to remind me where I came from before I embarrassed the family at Ethan's wedding by acting too important for my own father. Robert, in a rare display of open anger, told him plainly that if he called that house again trying to manipulate Diane, he would personally make sure Gerald received no invitation to the wedding at all. Gerald backed off after that call, but the silence that followed felt less like retreat and more like recalibration, the particular quiet of a man deciding on a different approach entirely. I brought it up with my mother over coffee the following weekend, watching her hands wrap tightly around her mug the way they always did when Gerald's name came up in conversation. "He's not going to let this go quietly," she said, staring out the kitchen window instead of at me. "I know your father, Rachel. When he can't get what he wants directly, he finds a way to make somebody pay for it publicly. Please, just be careful at the wedding." I told her I would be, though privately I assumed careful simply meant keeping physical distance between us at the reception. I had absolutely no idea how thoroughly my father intended to weaponize an open microphone and an audience of 300 people who had no context for the man standing in front of them. The wedding took place on a warm Saturday evening at a restored countryside estate an hour outside Charlotte, the kind of venue with manicured gardens, string lights woven through ancient oak trees, and a ballroom with soaring windows that framed the sunset perfectly behind the altar. Olivia looked luminous. Ethan cried openly during his vows, which made half the room cry along with him. My mother sat in the front row holding Robert's hand so tightly her knuckles went white, radiating a kind of quiet pride I hadn't seen on her face in years. For those first few hours, everything was exactly as beautiful as it was supposed to be. I had spent the morning of the wedding at my mother's house, the three of us, Diane, Olivia's mother, and me, getting ready together in a guest room upstairs while a photographer captured candid shots of curling irons and champagne flutes and the particular chaos of women helping each other with zippers they couldn't reach on their own. My mother kept touching my arm throughout, as though she needed the physical reassurance that I was actually there, actually calm, actually ready for a day she had clearly been quietly dreading for weeks. "You look beautiful," she told me, adjusting the strap of my dress in the mirror. "I need you to know that whatever happens today, I am so proud of the woman you turned into." I didn't understand, in that moment, how much weight that sentence was carrying, how much she already suspected about what the day might hold. Gerald arrived late to the ceremony, slipping into a back pew with a faint, unmistakable smell of whiskey already on him. I noticed, but I said nothing. I told myself that if I simply stayed calm, stayed pleasant, kept enough distance between us, the day would pass without incident. I have never been so wrong about anything in my life. During the cocktail hour, I watched him work the room, introducing himself to Whitman relatives with an easy, practiced charm that had always been his most dangerous skill. He laughed loudly at things that weren't particularly funny. He ordered drink after drink from the open bar. And every so often, his eyes would find me across the room, and something dark would flicker behind them before he looked away again. When the reception began and guests took their seats for dinner, the MC explained that the wedding party would be giving a few short toasts before the meal, starting with the best man, then the maid of honor, and finally, since Ethan had specifically requested it, a toast from his older sister. I had spent 2 weeks writing mine. I wanted to talk about the little boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long car rides, about the man he'd grown into, steady and kind in all the ways that mattered. I had it memorized. I had practiced it in the mirror. I was ready. The MC called my name and extended the microphone toward me. And that was the exact moment my father stood up from his seat 2 tables away, walked forward with the loose, overconfident gait of a man 3 drinks past his limit, and plucked the microphone directly out of the MC's hand before it ever reached mine. "Before I say anything else tonight," Gerald announced, his voice booming through the sound system, "I think somebody in this family needs to hear the truth for once." The room, which had been humming with soft conversation, went abruptly quiet. I watched confusion ripple across 300 faces as they tried to figure out who this man even was. My mother's face went white. Robert set down his fork very slowly, his eyes narrowing in a way I had genuinely never seen on him before. Ethan half rose from his seat, mouthing my father's name in disbelief. "You all think you know this family," Gerald continued, swaying slightly as he gestured toward me, with a microphone still clutched in his fist. But let me tell you about my daughter here. Rachel likes to walk around acting like she's better than the rest of us. Too important to help her own father when he needed it. Too busy with her little business to show up for family the way a daughter's supposed to. He turned to face me directly now, and I felt every single eye in that ballroom shift with him. You're not worth the invitation, Rachel. You never were. I only let them put you on this program because your mother begged me to keep the peace. I have relived that sentence more times than I can count since that night, trying to understand how a man could stand in front of his own daughter and say something so deliberately, surgically cruel, on a day that had nothing whatsoever to do with either of us. I felt my throat close. I felt 300 pairs of eyes settle on my face, waiting to see what I would do. And for one long, terrible moment, I genuinely did not know. That was when I heard the chair scrape back 2 tables over. Thomas Whitman, Olivia's father, the man whose company had built one of the most respected hospitality empires on the East Coast, rose slowly to his feet, set his napkin down with deliberate precision, and began walking directly toward the head table, his eyes fixed on my father the entire time. Every camera in that ballroom seemed to turn at once, phones lifting instinctively the way they always do when a room senses something is about to happen. My father, still holding the microphone, turned to see who was approaching, and I watched the color slowly drain out of his face as he realized exactly who was walking toward him. Thomas Whitman did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply stopped a few feet from my father, extended his hand toward the microphone, and said, quietly but audibly enough that the speakers carried every word, "I believe that belongs to my new daughter-in-law's sister-in-law. Would you mind handing it back to her?" Gerald hesitated, clearly trying to recalibrate, clearly trying to figure out who exactly this silver-haired stranger was and why the entire room seemed to be holding its breath around him. "I'm sorry," he said, forcing a laugh that came out thin and nervous. "And you are?" Thomas Whitman's expression didn't change. "I'm the father of the bride," he said, "and I happen to know exactly who your daughter is, though it seems you don't." A murmur rippled through the ballroom. My father blinked, clearly unprepared for this particular collision, his eyes darting briefly toward Robert, toward my mother, searching for some ally who might help him regain his footing. None came. He looked for just a moment, exactly like the man I remembered from the worst arguments of my childhood, the one who could talk his way out of anything until he suddenly, unexpectedly, couldn't. "What is that supposed to mean?" he asked, his bravado already starting to crack around the edges, his voice noticeably less steady than it had been 30 seconds earlier. Thomas Whitman turned, just slightly, so that his next words were directed as much at the room as at my father. 3 months ago, he said, my company was in the middle of the most difficult data breach crisis in our history. We were bleeding client trust, bleeding revenue, and every consulting firm we brought in told us the same thing, that it would take a year to rebuild our systems and our reputation. Then my board brought in a firm out of Charlotte that restructured our entire risk architecture in 11 weeks and personally walked our executive team through every fix, staying until 2 in the morning more nights than I can count. That firm was run by a woman named Rachel Bennett. I didn't know, until my daughter mentioned it during wedding planning 3 weeks ago, that Rachel Bennett was about to become my new son-in-law's sister. The ballroom had gone almost completely silent now, the kind of silence that has weight to it. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Thomas Whitman turned back to face my father directly. "So when you stand up at your own son's wedding and tell your daughter she isn't worth the invitation," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of contempt, "I have to wonder whether you have any idea who your daughter actually is. Because from where I'm sitting, sir, this family is lucky to have her, and this room is full of people who would very much like to hear the toast she actually came here to give." I don't think I will ever forget the sound that followed, a low wave of applause that started somewhere near the Whitman family's tables and rolled outward until it filled the entire ballroom. My father stood frozen in the middle of it, the microphone still limp in his hand, his face cycling rapidly through shock, humiliation, and a rage he was visibly struggling to contain in front of 300 witnesses. Robert Hale rose from his seat then, walked calmly over to my father, and without raising his voice, without making a single scene of his own, simply extended his hand and said, I think it's time you gave my daughter the microphone. My daughter. Not his stepdaughter, not Diane's daughter. My daughter. I felt tears sting my eyes for an entirely different reason than the ones I'd been fighting back a moment earlier. Gerald handed the microphone to Robert, who walked it over to me himself and pressed it gently into my hand, his eyes steady and warm despite everything that had just happened around us. "Take your time," he murmured, "just for me. Nobody's going anywhere." I looked out at that sea of faces, at my mother with tears streaming silently down her cheeks, at Ethan gripping Olivia's hand like it was the only solid thing left in the room, and I found, somehow, that my voice didn't shake at all when I finally spoke. "I had a speech prepared," I said, and the room let out a small ripple of nervous laughter that helped loosen something tight in my chest. "But I think what I actually want to say is simpler than anything I wrote down. My brother has never once, in 32 years, made me feel like I wasn't worth something. Not when I was 17 and terrified about college applications. Not when I was 26 and quitting a stable job to start a business with 3 months of savings and no idea if it would work. Ethan has been in my corner for every single version of myself I have ever tried to become, and tonight, watching him marry a woman who clearly comes from a family that understands what real loyalty looks like, I have never been more certain that he ended up exactly where he was always meant to be. To Ethan and Olivia, may your marriage be built on the kind of love that shows up every single time, without needing to be asked." The applause that followed was longer and warmer than anything that had come before it, and I watched my father slip quietly toward the back exit of the ballroom while every single person in that room was looking at me instead of him. The rest of the reception unfolded in a strange, dreamlike blur. Guests I barely knew came up to me throughout the evening, some offering quiet words of support, others simply asking, with poorly disguised curiosity, who exactly that man had been. Olivia's mother pulled me into a tight hug near the dessert table and told me, in a low voice only I could hear, that she'd dealt with a difficult father-in-law of her own once, decades ago, and that whatever I was feeling right now, it would not define the rest of my life the way it felt like it might in this exact moment. Ethan found me during the last slow dance of the night, pulling me onto the floor despite my protests that this was his moment, not mine. "I'm sorry," he kept saying, his forehead pressed briefly against mine the way it had when he was small and scared of thunderstorms. "I should have seen this coming. I should have protected you from him tonight." I told him the same thing I would end up telling myself many times over the following weeks. "You didn't do this, Ethan. He did. Don't let him steal one more second of your wedding by making you feel responsible for his choices." I would love to tell you that was the end of it, that Gerald slunk off into the night, and we never had to deal with him again. But men like my father do not disappear after a public humiliation. They regroup. And what happened over the following 6 weeks would end up testing every ounce of resolve I had spent a decade building. He called me the next morning, before I'd even had my coffee, his voice thick with the particular self-pity of a man who has had all night to reframe his own humiliation into someone else's cruelty. "You embarrass me in front of that entire family," he said, as though he hadn't been the one standing at a microphone announcing that his own daughter wasn't worth an invitation. "I didn't embarrass you, Dad," I said, setting down my mug with a steadiness that surprised even me. "You did that yourself in front of 300 witnesses, using a microphone nobody handed you." There was a pause. Then his voice sharpened. "That Whitman guy had no business putting his nose into our family business. Our family business," I repeated slowly, "is the reason I have spent 11 years cleaning up whatever mess you left behind, Dad." Thomas Whitman just happened to be standing close enough to see it happen in real time. He hung up on me again. I sat with the silence for a long moment, and then, almost without deciding to, I opened the Notes app on my phone and started a new file. I titled it simply, Documentation. Every loan, every unreturned call, every promise broken. I had already saved most of the bank statements over the years out of some instinct I couldn't fully name, but that morning, I understood exactly why I'd been keeping them. Somewhere deep down, I think I had always known this day was coming. I spent that entire weekend at my dining table with my laptop open, cross-referencing 11 years of bank statements against a timeline I built from memory and old text threads I hadn't deleted. $23,000 in wire transfers between the ages of 23 and 28, back when I still believed each one might be the last. Another $16,000 spread across the following 6 years, smaller amounts but more frequent, as though Gerald had learned that modest, regular requests drew less resistance than large, occasional ones. I printed screenshots of the text messages where he'd asked for each one, highlighting the specific language he used, the same handful of phrases rotating through every request. "You're the only one who understands. I wouldn't ask if I had any other option. I'll pay you back the second things turn around." None of it ever had. By the time I finished organizing everything into a single folder, my hands were shaking, not from anger exactly, but from the sheer, undeniable weight of finally seeing the whole pattern laid out in black and white instead of scattered across a decade of individually forgivable moments. 2 weeks after the wedding, my mother called me in tears, something she almost never did. "Your father has been posting things online," she said, her voice cracking. "Terrible things, Rachel. About you, about the family, about how ungrateful you are." I asked her to send me the link, and while I waited, she kept talking, her words tumbling out faster than usual. "Cousin Marlene saw it first and called me this morning," she said. "She wanted to know if it was true, if you'd really cut your father off without any warning, if you'd really refused to help him when he needed it." I told her the truth, that you've been helping him for over a decade and finally stopped. "But Rachel, I don't know how many other people are seeing this and not calling to ask first. I don't know how many people are just believing him." I felt something twist painfully in my chest, not for myself exactly, but for my mother, who had spent 11 years quietly rebuilding a reputation Gerald had once dragged through their divorce, only to have him threaten to drag it through the mud all over again. I opened the social media app with a knot already forming in my stomach and found a lengthy public post from Gerald's account, framed as a heartbroken father finally speaking his truth. He claimed I had cut him off financially out of pure cruelty after he'd sacrificed everything to raise me. He claimed I had orchestrated a public humiliation at my own brother's wedding to make myself look important in front of wealthy strangers. He claimed, most audaciously of all, that I had never once helped him financially and had instead spent years exploiting his good nature. The post had already accumulated several dozen shares by the time I found it, mostly from people who didn't know either of us and simply enjoyed a good family scandal. I sat very still for a long time, feeling something inside me shift from hurt into something colder and more useful. If he wanted to fight in public, I could fight in public too, but I intended to do it with receipts instead of self-pity. I called Ethan first. "Have you seen it?" I asked. "He's lost his mind," Ethan said, his voice tight with anger on my behalf. "Rachel, I'll say something. I'll post something defending you right now." "Not yet," I told him. "Let me handle this the right way first." I called an attorney the following morning, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Colston who specialized in defamation and family financial disputes. After I walked her through everything, laying out 11 years of bank transfers, texts, and the timeline of the wedding incident, she leaned back in her chair and said simply, "This is about as clean a defamation case as I've ever seen. Every claim he's making online is directly contradicted by your own financial records. We send a cease and desist first. If he doesn't take the post down and issue a correction, we escalate." The cease and desist letter went out that afternoon, and for 2 days, nothing happened. In the meantime, the post kept circulating in a smaller circle than I'd feared, but a more painful one than I'd expected, mostly among people who had known our family years ago, back when Gerald still lived under the same roof as us. A former neighbor commented that she'd always suspected something was off about Diane's kids. "Cold little things," she wrote, clearly taking Gerald's version at face value. An old family friend messaged me privately asking if everything was okay, whether I needed someone to talk to, and I found myself typing and deleting 3 different responses before finally just thanking her for checking in and saying nothing else. It was a strange, specific kind of exposure. Watching strangers and half-strangers debate the shape of your character based on a handful of paragraphs written by a man who hadn't lived in your house since you were 10 years old. Then, on the 3rd day, my father did something that finally, truly frightened me. He showed up outside my office building. I was walking out of a client meeting around 6 in the evening, running through the notes on my phone, when I heard my name called across the parking garage in a voice thick with anger and alcohol. Gerald was leaning against a concrete pillar near the entrance, his tie gone, his shirt wrinkled, clearly having been there for some time. "Rachel," he said, pushing off the pillar and walking unsteadily toward me. "We need to talk about this lawyer nonsense." I stopped several feet away, keeping the distance deliberate. "This is my workplace," I said. "You need to leave." "You set me a legal threat," he snapped, his voice rising. "Over what?" "Telling the truth about my own family." I felt my pulse spike, but I kept my voice level. "The truth would be a good place to start," I said. "You're welcome to tell it. The truth is that I have given you nearly $40,000 over 11 years and never once seen a dollar of it repaid. The truth is that you humiliated me at my brother's wedding in front of 300 people because I finally told you no. If you want to post the truth, Dad, I have the bank statements to help you get every number exactly right." His face contorted with something between fury and panic. "You think you're so much better than me now," he said, taking a step closer. "Big, important businesswoman, hobnobbing with hotel tycoons, looking down on the father who raised you." "You didn't raise me," I said, and my voice finally cracked, not from weakness, but from 11 years of held-back grief finally finding an exit. "Robert raised me. You left. You have spent every year since then showing up only when you needed something, and I kept giving it to you because some stupid part of me kept hoping you'd eventually turn into the father I actually needed. I'm done hoping, Dad. I'm done paying for a relationship that only exists when you want my money." Two of my junior analysts had watched the entire exchange from the glass doors of the lobby, and by the time I made it back upstairs, my office manager, a steady, no-nonsense woman named Priya, was waiting for me with a concerned expression. "Rachel," she said carefully, one of the partners from the Whitman account called down to the front desk asking if everything was all right. "I think word travels fast in a parking garage with security cameras." I felt my stomach drop, imagining the story reaching Thomas Whitman's team wrapped in exactly the kind of chaos that could unravel months of carefully built trust. I called their office directly within the hour, prepared to explain, prepared even to apologize for a scene I hadn't caused. Instead, the account partner on the other end of the line simply said, "We heard there was some trouble outside your building. Is your family all right? I want you to know Mr. Whitman already told us after the wedding that if this ever came up, we were to extend you whatever support you needed." That's not a conversation you have about someone you're worried about losing as a partner, Rachel. That's a conversation you have about someone you intend to keep. A security guard, alerted by another employee who had noticed the confrontation, approached at that moment and asked Gerald to leave the property. He resisted for a moment, shouting something about how I would regret this, before finally allowing himself to be walked out toward the street. I stood in that parking garage for a long time afterward, shaking, but underneath the shaking, something had settled into place that felt almost like relief. I had finally said, out loud, everything I had been swallowing for over a decade. That night, I sent Patricia Colston the security footage from the parking garage, along with a full written account of the confrontation. "We're filing for a restraining order first thing tomorrow," she said. "This has moved past defamation into harassment. I want you protected while we handle the rest of this properly." In between the workplace confrontation and what came next, Gerald tried one more angle I hadn't anticipated. He reached out to a former business associate of Robert's, a man named Frank who sat on the board of one of Robert's hotel properties, apparently hoping to use an old, distant connection to get a message to Robert directly, framed as a father simply wanting to make peace before things escalated any further. Frank, confused about why a stranger was contacting him about a family matter, called Robert directly to ask what on earth was going on. Robert relayed the entire conversation to me over dinner that weekend, visibly irritated in a way I rarely saw from him. He told Frank he wanted to, quote, "clear the air before this gets uglier for everyone," Robert said, shaking his head. As if there's some version of ugliness I'm supposed to be worried about on his behalf. I told Frank exactly what's been happening, and Frank told me he's cutting off any further contact from Gerald entirely. "Your father is running out of doors to knock on, Rachel, and every single one he tries seems to make things worse for him instead of better." I remember feeling, at the time, A strange combination of vindication and exhaustion, the particular tiredness that comes from watching someone you once needed to love you spiral in real time, unable to stop making the exact choices that keep costing him everything. Part of me wanted to reach out, to warn him that he was making things worse, that there was still a version of this where he simply stopped and let the consequences settle instead of continuing to escalate. But I had learned, slowly and expensively, that warnings had never once changed my father's behavior in 32 years, and I wasn't willing to spend any more of myself trying. The following week brought the second crisis, one I never saw coming. My mother, who had been managing high blood pressure quietly for the past several years, collapsed to her home after Gerald showed up uninvited at her front door, drunk and shouting, demanding she talk sense into me before I ruined him publicly. Robert called me in a panic I had never heard in his voice before. "Your mother's not breathing right," he said, his words tumbling over each other. "The ambulance is almost here. I need you to meet us at the hospital." I don't remember the drive there. I remember the sterile fluorescent lights of the emergency room waiting area, the specific plastic texture of the chair I sat in for 3 hours, and the particular way time seems to stretch and collapse simultaneously when someone you love is behind doors you aren't allowed to open. Robert paced the hallway, his usually composed face etched with a fear that made him look, for the first time since I'd known him, genuinely old. Ethan and Olivia arrived within the hour, Olivia's father Thomas Whitman calling personally to offer his hospital's best cardiac specialist for a consultation, an offer Robert accepted with a gratitude too raw for words. I sat next to Robert in the waiting room, watching him try and fail to hold himself together, and something in me finally broke open in a way it hadn't broken during the wedding humiliation, or the parking garage confrontation, or any of the legal maneuvering that had consumed the previous weeks. "This is my fault," I whispered, more to myself than to him. If I hadn't pushed back on his post, if I hadn't filed the cease and desist, none of this would have happened. Robert turned to me sharply, his eyes suddenly clear despite the fear still written across the rest of his face. "Don't you dare," he said, his voice low but fierce. "Don't you dare carry that. Your father did this. Not you. You spent 11 years giving that man chance after chance, and the one time you finally drew a line, he decided the appropriate response was to terrorize a 60-year-old woman on her own porch. This is his fault, Rachel, every last piece of it, and if any part of you walks out of this hospital tonight believing otherwise, I will personally sit you down and go through the timeline until you understand it the way I do." I remember pressing my palms against my eyes, trying to hold back the kind of crying that comes from somewhere much deeper than a single bad night, the kind that has been building for years and simply chooses its moment without asking permission. A nurse walked by with a clipboard, glanced at us, and softened her pace just slightly, the way people do when they recognize a family in the middle of its worst hour. Ethan sat on my other side, his arm around my shoulders, not saying anything at all, just present in the exact way he had always been present for me since he was old enough to understand what presence even meant. The doctor who finally emerged told us my mother had suffered a hypertensive crisis brought on, in her exact words, by an acute and prolonged period of stress. She would recover, the doctor assured us, but she needed to be kept completely free of confrontation and emotional strain for the foreseeable future. Whatever is causing the stress, the doctor said gently, needs to be resolved, or resolved away from her immediately. I sat beside my mother's hospital bed that night, holding her hand while machines beeped steadily around us, and I made a decision I should have made years earlier. Whatever guilt I still carried about my father, whatever small, stubborn hope I had been holding on to that he might one day become someone different, I released it completely in that hospital room. My mother's health was not a price I was willing to let him extract from this family any longer. The next morning, I called Patricia Colston and told her to pursue everything, the restraining order, the defamation suit, all of it, with no more hesitation. She filed within 48 hours. Gerald was served the papers at the extended stay motel where he'd apparently been living since before the wedding, a detail that came out during the process and explained, at least partially, the desperation behind his behavior. He had been quietly falling apart financially for over a year, and rather than admit it to any of us, he had chosen to weaponize his shame into cruelty instead. The restraining order hearing took place 3 weeks later in a Mecklenburg County courtroom that felt almost absurdly ordinary for the weight of everything it represented. Gerald showed up in a suit that didn't quite fit him anymore, looking smaller than I remembered him being, smaller than the man who had once seemed larger than my entire childhood. Patricia laid out the evidence methodically. 11 years of financial transfers, the defamatory social media posts, the parking garage confrontation caught clearly on security footage, and finally, the hospital records documenting my mother's hypertensive crisis directly following his uninvited visit. Gerald's attorney, a tired-looking public defender who had clearly been handed this case with little enthusiasm, offered almost no meaningful defense. At one point during his brief testimony, Gerald tried to characterize the entire 11 years of loans as gifts, freely given, nothing he had ever pressured me into providing. Patricia turned to me with a small, controlled nod, and I read from a printed page the exact wording of a text message he had sent me 4 years earlier, one I had saved along with everything else. "Rachel, I really need this by Friday, or I'm going to lose the apartment," it read. "You're the only one who's ever come through for me. Please don't let me down this time." I watched the judge's expression shift almost imperceptibly as I read it aloud, and I watched Gerald's shoulders drop half an inch lower in his seat. "That doesn't sound like an unpressured gift to me," Patricia said simply, and moved on to the next exhibit before his attorney could formulate an objection. During cross-examination, Gerald's attorney tried a different approach, suggesting that my refusal to continue lending money was itself a provocation, that any reasonable father might feel hurt enough to react emotionally under those circumstances. Patricia didn't even blink. "Setting a boundary after 11 years of one-sided financial support is not a provocation," she said evenly. "It is a decision an adult is entitled to make about her own finances without fear of public humiliation, online harassment, workplace intimidation, or a visit to her elderly mother's home that results in hospitalization. If my client's decision to stop funding her father's lifestyle is the provocation you're pointing to, Your Honor, I'd ask the court to consider what that says about the respondent's understanding of boundaries in the first place." The attorney had no real response, and I watched Gerald sink another half-inch lower in his chair. When it came time for closing statements, Gerald's attorney made a final, halting attempt to frame the wedding incident as a private family matter that had simply gotten out of hand, unfortunate but not criminal. Patricia stood, smoothed her blazer, and addressed the judge directly. "Your Honor, this was never simply about a bad night at a wedding," she said. "This is about a documented, decade-long pattern in which my client extended financial and emotional support to her father, only to be publicly humiliated the first time she declined to continue doing so, followed by an online smear campaign, a workplace confrontation, and finally a visit to her mother's home that resulted in a hospitalization. Ms. Bennett is not asking this court for revenge. She is asking for the ability to build the life she has earned without her father's continued interference in it." The judge granted the restraining order without much deliberation, along with an order requiring Gerald to issue a public retraction of his defamatory posts within 7 days or face additional civil penalties. As we left the courtroom, Gerald caught my eye across the hallway one last time. For a moment, something flickered across his face that almost looked like the man I remembered from before he left, before the resentment calcified into something permanent. "Rachel," he started to say. I didn't stop walking. I had spent 32 years waiting for that particular version of my father to show up. I wasn't willing to wait any longer. The retraction post went up exactly on the deadline, terse and clearly written under legal pressure rather than genuine remorse. "I am retracting my previous statements regarding my daughter, Rachel Bennett," it read, which were not accurate and were made in a moment of poor judgment. "I wish her well." 6 sentences, no apology beyond the bare legal minimum required, nothing resembling accountability for 11 years of borrowed money or a single humiliating night at a wedding. Still, it was enough to satisfy the court order, and enough for the small handful of people who had seen the original post to understand the truth. Within days, the online noise died down entirely, the way these things always eventually do once the truth becomes undeniable and boring compared to the drama that came before it. The first family gathering after my mother's recovery from the hospital was a quiet, deliberately low-key affair, just the six of us: Robert, Diane, Ethan, Olivia, Marcus, and me, gathered around the same kitchen island where I would come to spend so many Sunday evenings over the following year. Nobody mentioned Gerald's name once the entire night, not out of avoidance exactly, but because there simply wasn't room for him in a conversation that was, for the first time in longer than I could remember, entirely about the people who were actually present. At one point, Robert raised his glass, somewhat awkwardly, clearly unused to giving toasts of his own, and simply said, "To showing up, and to the people who do." It wasn't eloquent. It didn't need to be. Everyone at that table understood exactly what he meant. My mother came home from the hospital 10 days later. Her color returned. Her blood pressure finally stabilized under close monitoring. Robert had quietly redecorated the sunroom while she was recovering, filling it with the orchids she loved, insisting she spend her mornings there instead of in the kitchen where stress always seemed to find her. For the first few weeks after she came home, I drove over almost every evening after work, sometimes just to sit with her while she read, sometimes to help Robert manage the small mountain of instructions the cardiologist had sent home with them: medication schedules, dietary restrictions, gentle reminders about stress management that felt almost darkly comic given the source of nearly all her stress over the previous month. She never once complained about any of it. She simply adjusted, the way she had always adjusted, quietly and without fanfare, to whatever life required of her next. One evening, a few weeks into her recovery, I found her sitting alone in the sunroom at dusk, watering the orchids with the small copper can Robert had bought her years earlier. She looked up when I came in and patted the cushion beside her. "I keep thinking about something," she said, once I'd settled next to her. "All those years I stayed quiet about your father, hoping it would somehow spare you and Ethan from carrying my anger toward him. I wonder now if staying quiet just taught you both that his behavior was something to be managed instead of something to be named." I told her she had nothing to apologize for, that she had done exactly what she needed to do to keep our family afloat during years when there hadn't been room for anything beyond survival. She squeezed my hand and didn't say anything else, but something in her expression eased, as though she'd been carrying that particular guilt for longer than either of us had realized. Watching Robert and my mother together in that room, months later, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. Robert Hale had never once tried to be my father in the traditional sense. He had simply, patiently, consistently shown up as one, year after year, until the title stopped mattering and the reality of it became the only thing that counted. 6 weeks after the restraining order was finalized, Thomas Whitman called me directly, something that still surprised me every time it happened, given the man's stature in an industry I had spent years quietly building a reputation within. "Rachel," he said, "I've been discussing something with my board, and I wanted to run it by you before we made anything official. We're expanding into 3 new markets next year, and frankly, after what your team did for us during the breach, I don't want to work with anyone else on the risk architecture. I'd like to discuss bringing your firm on as our exclusive analytics partner for the expansion." It was, without exaggeration, the single largest contract opportunity of my entire career, and it had arrived not despite the wedding disaster, but in some strange, roundabout way, because of it. I thought about my father standing at that microphone, so certain he was diminishing me in front of the room, so utterly blind to who I had actually become while he wasn't paying attention. There was a particular kind of justice in the fact that his cruelty had been witnessed by the exact person whose respect would go on to change the entire trajectory of my company. The contract negotiations stretched across the following 4 months, and I found myself, for the first time in years, staffing up rather than stretching thin, hiring 2 senior analysts and a junior project manager just to handle the scope of what Whitman's expansion required. I remember standing in my newly leased second office space, watching movers carry in desks that hadn't existed in my company a year earlier, and feeling a kind of quiet, unshowy pride that had nothing to do with proving anything to my father anymore. It had simply become, at some point during those long months, entirely about the work itself, and about the people I was building something alongside. Ethan and Olivia settled into their new home a few months after the wedding, and I found myself, for the first time in years, looking forward to family dinners instead of dreading them. Without Gerald's presence looming over every gathering, something in our family had loosened, softened, become the kind of easy warmth I had always secretly wanted but never quite believed we were allowed to have. My mother started laughing more freely. Robert began referring to me, without any hesitation at all, simply as his daughter, no qualifiers attached. I met someone eventually, the way these things happen when you least expect them to. His name was Marcus, a structural engineer who consulted occasionally with Thomas Whitman's construction division, and we were introduced at a company event I almost didn't attend, having spent the entire drive over debating whether I had the energy to make small talk with strangers after the year I'd had. He found me standing alone near the dessert table, deliberately avoiding a cluster of executives deep in a conversation about zoning permits, and instead of launching into the usual networking small talk, he simply asked which dessert I'd recommend, as though that were the only question that mattered in the room. He was steady in a way that reminded me, at first, uncomfortably of Robert, before I realized that steadiness was exactly what I had been looking for all along, whether I'd admitted it to myself or not. 3 months into dating him, I finally told him the full story of the wedding, the restraining order, the hospital, all of it, bracing myself for the slight recoil people sometimes give when they realize how much baggage sits underneath a person they've only recently started caring about. Marcus listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he asked only one question. Does he know how proud everyone else is of you? I told him I didn't think Gerald was capable of being proud of anyone but himself. Then that's his loss, Marcus said simply, and reached for my hand across the table, and it never came up again unless I was the one who brought it up. He never once asked me to prove my worth to him. He simply, from the very beginning, assumed it, the way people do, when they've never had a reason to doubt someone's value in the first place. Nearly a year after the wedding, I received a text message from an unknown number. I almost didn't open it, some old instinct still bracing for another confrontation before I'd even read a word. It was from Gerald. I heard about your contract with Whitman's company. It read, I should have known who you were becoming a long time ago. I'm sorry for what I said. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know I finally understand what I lost. I read it twice, sitting alone in my apartment with the evening light coming in gold and low through the windows. I felt, for the first time in over a decade, something almost like peace settle over the whole exhausting shape of our history together. I thought about typing back something short, something final, some version of the closure people always assume you need in moments like this. I thought about all the calls, the loans, the birthday cards that stopped coming, the microphone he'd taken out of my hand in front of 300 strangers because some small, wounded part of him had decided that tearing me down was easier than admitting he had nothing left to offer me but apology. I didn't respond right away. I'm not certain I ever will. Not because I'm holding on to anger, but because some doors, once you've finally found the strength to close them, are better left that way. I deleted the message, set my phone down on the counter, and went back to finishing dinner, the kitchen filled with the quiet, ordinary sound of a life I had built entirely on my own terms, one that no longer needed anyone's permission to be worth something. A few weeks later, my mother hosted a small Sunday dinner, the kind we'd started having regularly since her recovery. Everyone gathered loosely around the kitchen island the way families do when nothing formal needs to happen for the evening to feel complete. Robert stood at the stove, humming something off-key while he stirred a pot of his famous chili, and Ethan was arguing good-naturedly with Olivia about a movie neither of them could agree on. I sat on a bar stool with a glass of wine, watching all of it unfold, and I found myself thinking, not for the first time, that I had spent so many years believing family was something you were simply born into, something fixed and unchangeable no matter how badly it hurt you. It took losing my father twice, once when he left, and once when he finally showed me exactly who he was in front of 300 witnesses, to understand the truth. Family isn't the people who share your blood. It's the people who show up, over and over, long after they have any obligation left to. Outside, the late afternoon sun was slipping low behind the trees in Robert and my mother's backyard, casting everything in that particular amber light that makes even ordinary evenings feel like something worth remembering. I raised my glass slightly toward no one in particular, toward the life I had quietly built out of every hard, lonely year that came before it, and I let myself, finally, without reservation, feel proud of exactly how far I had come. Marcus arrived a little later that evening, letting himself in through the side door the way he'd started doing after enough months of Sunday dinners that Robert had simply handed him a spare key without ceremony. He kissed the top of my head as he passed behind my bar stool, then went straight to the stove to needle Robert about his chili recipe, the two of them falling into an easy, teasing rhythm that still occasionally caught me off guard with how natural it felt, how quickly this new configuration of people had become simply what family looked like now. My mother caught my eye from across the kitchen and smiled, the specific soft smile she'd started giving me ever since her recovery, the one that said, without needing any words at all, that she saw exactly how far we had both come. Later, after everyone else had gone home and the kitchen had been cleaned, I sat alone on Robert and my mother's back porch for a while, the way I sometimes did before driving home, watching the last of the light disappear behind the tree line. I thought about the version of myself who had stood frozen in that ballroom 18 months earlier, microphone finally back in her hands, unsure whether her voice would even work. I thought about how certain I had been in that moment that my father's words might actually be true, that some small, stubborn part of me had spent 32 years quietly waiting for him to confirm exactly what I feared about my own worth. He had tried, one last time, to make that fear permanent. Instead, he had simply handed me, without meaning to, the clearest possible proof of everyone in my life who had already decided, long before that night, that I was worth far more than he ever gave me credit for. I don't know if Gerald will ever fully understand what he lost that evening, or in the years of neglect that led up to it. I've made peace with the fact that I may never know, and stranger still, I've made peace with the fact that it no longer changes anything about how I choose to live. Family, I've learned, was never something I needed to inherit. It was something I got to build deliberately with the people who kept choosing to show up long after they had any obligation left to. Outside, the late afternoon sun was slipping low behind the trees in Robert and my mother's backyard, casting everything in that particular amber light that makes even ordinary evenings feel like something worth remembering. I raised my glass slightly toward no one in particular, toward the life I had quietly built out of every hard, lonely year that came before it, and I let myself, finally, without reservation, feel proud of exactly how far I had come.